The cameras were still flashing when Peter Green signed away his bloodline. Upstairs, applause, champagne, and power. Downstairs, his parents, soaked in rain, stared at a billboard 20 feet tall that called him the future of sustainable business. Minutes later, a courier handed them an envelope sealed with their son's EMPIR logo. Inside wasn't a gift, it was exile. A condemned house. A final betrayal disguised as generosity. Lawrence looked at the deed, then the storm, and said coldly, "He thinks he buried us. He just gave us the land to rise again." Before we continue this thrilling story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. Peter's Mont Blanc pen moved across the final signature line with practiced precision. Each stroke severed another thread connecting him to the life he'd spent 30 years escaping. The assembled executives applauded as cameras flashed, but Peter's focus remained laser-sharp on the document before him. Buried within the merger's legal labyrinth was a single clause that would never make headlines. The immediate dissolution of all family financial ties, effective upon signing. "Congratulations, Mr. Green," said Kraftwerk's CEO, extending a manicured hand. "You've built something remarkable." "Thank you," Peter replied, his smile camera perfect. "Sometimes you have to cut away the dead weight to let something truly great flourish." 30 floors below, in a rusted Chevy pickup that had seen better decades, Lawrence Green gripped the steering wheel with hands that bore the permanent stains of honest work. His knuckles were white against the cracked leather, weathered from 40 years in the textile mills that had funded his son's education. His ambitions, his transformation into someone Lawrence no longer recognized. Beside him, Wendy pressed her oxygen mask closer to her face, the portable concentrator humming its mechanical rhythm between her feet. Her lungs, destroyed by years of cotton dust and chemical fumes, struggled in the humid air as she stared up at the massive digital billboard dominating the square. There was their son, 20 feet tall and glowing, his face sharp with success and confidence. The caption beneath read, "Peter Green, the future of sustainable business." "Look at him," Wendy whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming against the truck's roof. "So handsome. So successful." Lawrence said nothing. He'd stopped recognizing the man in those photographs years ago, when Peter first started avoiding their calls, when the Christmas visits became obligatory hour-long appearances, when their grandson, Peter's only child, learned to call them Lawrence and Wendy instead of Grandpa and Grandma because it was more professional for a Green Industries heir. "We should go," Lawrence finally said, "before someone sees us." The irony wasn't lost on him. Hiding from their own son like criminals, as if their existence was somehow shameful. As if the love that had built him, the sacrifices that had funded him, the prayers that had protected him, were embarrassments to be concealed from his glittering new world. They drove home through streets that no longer felt like theirs, past coffee shops that charged more for a single cup than Lawrence used to make in an hour, past boutiques displaying clothes that cost more than their monthly Social Security check. The city Peter had helped gentrify had pushed them to the margins, making them strangers in the place they'd called home for 50 years. That evening, as the storm reached its peak, a Tesla Model S pulled into their driveway. The courier who emerged wore a charcoal suit and carried a waterproof briefcase like it contained state secrets. He knocked once, handed Lawrence an envelope marked "Confidential," "Immediate attention required," and disappeared back into the rain without a word. Lawrence's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. Inside was a single legal document, its letterhead bearing the Green Industries logo, a stylized tree that Peter had designed to represent growth, sustainability, and forward thinking. The irony of using a family tree to destroy a family wasn't lost on Lawrence. Wendy appeared at his shoulder, oxygen tank trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. Together, they read the document that would change everything. Deed transfer. Green Family Homestead, 1247, Hollow Creek Road. Full ownership granted to Lawrence and Wendy Green, effective immediately. Property transferred as is, no warranty expressed or implied. At the bottom, Peter's signature gleamed in blue ink, bold and confident. There was no accompanying letter, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what this property meant to their family history. Just a legal document treating them like strangers. Wendy's voice broke the silence, trembling with disbelief. "He's giving us the old place." Lawrence stared at the deed, memories flooding back. The homestead had been his father's pride, built in 1923 when the Green family first settled in the mountains. It had been condemned 15 years ago after a series of harsh winters collapsed part of the roof and cracked the foundation beyond repair. The local government had wanted to demolish it, but the family had fought to keep it, paying taxes on worthless land out of sentiment and stubbornness. Now Lawrence understood. This wasn't generosity. This wasn't reconciliation. "No," he said, his voice hardening into something unfamiliar even to himself. "He's giving us our punishment." The implications were clear. Peter had found the perfect way to exile them without looking like the villain. He could tell his sophisticated friends that he'd given his parents property, that he'd been generous, that he'd honored family tradition. He didn't need to mention that the property was uninhabitable, worthless, a deliberate insult wrapped in legal kindness. They spent the next 3 hours in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Wendy methodically packed their few valuable possessions. Photo albums, her mother's china, the handmade quilt that had covered them through 5 decades of marriage. Lawrence gathered his tools, the ones that still worked, and loaded the truck with their canned goods and medicine. Ranger, their aging golden retriever, seemed to sense the change in the air. Instead of his usual evening nap, he paced restlessly through the small apartment, whimpering softly as boxes accumulated by the door. When Lawrence finally opened the truck's tailgate, Ranger leapt into the back without hesitation, his tail wagging against the storm as if this were an adventure rather than an exile. "At least someone's optimistic," Wendy said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As they pulled away from the apartment complex where they'd lived since downsizing 5 years ago, Lawrence caught sight of their reflection in the rearview mirror. 2 old people, a sick woman and a broken man, driving toward an uncertain future in a truck older than some of Peter's employees. Behind them, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white, beautiful and distant as stars. The mansion where Peter lived, where they'd been invited exactly twice in 10 years, glowed like a beacon on the hill above them. Its windows blazed with warm light, and Lawrence could imagine the scene inside. His son perhaps celebrating his latest triumph, his daughter-in-law hosting another charity fundraiser, his grandson learning to see poverty as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be lived. As the mansion lights faded behind them, Wendy pressed her face against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass. 50 years of love, she whispered. And this is how it ends. Lawrence felt something shift inside him, a weight he'd carried for decades finally settling into place. He started the engine, its familiar rumble drowning out the sound of rain, and pulled onto the highway that would take them away from everything they'd known. "No," he said, his voice steady for the first time in months. "This is how it begins." The drive to Hollow Creek took 4 hours through winding mountain roads that seemed designed to discourage visitors. With each mile, civilization peeled away like old paint, leaving only towering pines and the weight of abandonment pressing against the truck's windows. Wendy's oxygen concentrator labored in the thinning air, its mechanical wheeze mixing with the engine's struggling rhythm as they climbed toward 8,500 feet. When their headlights finally swept across 1247, Hollow Creek Road, the full scope of Peter's cruelty revealed itself. The homestead sat alone against the mountain backdrop like a broken tooth in a skull's grin. Windows gaped hollow and dark, their glass long since shattered by storms and neglect. Ivy had strangled the red brick walls, twisting through gaps in the mortar with parasitic determination. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and debris, its Victorian gingerbread trim rotting into lace-thin fragments. Lawrence killed the engine, and silence crashed over them like a physical blow. No electricity hummed through power lines because there were no power lines. No streetlights cast comforting pools of illumination because the nearest street was 40 miles down the mountain. Only darkness, deeper and more complete than either of them had experienced in decades of city living. "Jesus," Lawrence breathed, his voice swallowed by the vastness surrounding them. "He really wants us to disappear." Ranger was already out of the truck before Lawrence could lower the tailgate, circling the property with purposeful energy that seemed impossible given his 12 years. Instead of the fear they'd expected, the dog fleeing into the wilderness, he moved with focused determination, nose to the frozen ground like a detective gathering evidence. "What's he doing?" Wendy asked, pulling her coat tighter against the mountain cold that bit through fabric like teeth. "Being smarter than our son," Lawrence muttered, watching the dog's methodical inspection. "He's checking if it's survivable." The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing glimpses of devastation within. Lawrence's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene from a nightmare. Inside, mold crept across the walls in abstract patterns of black and green, feeding on decades of moisture and neglect. Dust blanketed everything like volcanic ash. Forgotten furniture, rusted tools, fragments of the life his father had built here before the war changed everything. Water damage had warped the hardwood floors into a topography of hills and valleys. In the kitchen, the hand pump well that had once been their grandfather's pride had seized solid with rust. The stone fireplace listed dangerously to one side, its chimney separated from the house proper, allowing snow to drift across what had once been a living room. Lawrence sank onto an overturned wooden crate, the magnitude of their situation crushing down like the weight of the mountains themselves. They had $2,347 in their joint account, enough canned goods for maybe 10 days, and Wendy's critical heart medication that would run out in exactly 14 days. The nearest pharmacy was a 2-hour drive through roads that would be impassable once the serious snow began. "Wendy, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice cracking under the pressure of 5 decades of responsibility. "I gave him everything we had, everything we were, and now—" A sharp metallic clang interrupted his despair. Ranger stood in the far corner of the main room, pawing at something beneath a pile of debris. His tail wagged with excitement as he dug through rotted floorboards and accumulated leaves, his claws striking metal with each scratch. "What did you find, boy?" Lawrence asked, pushing himself off the crate with joints that protested every movement. Together, they cleared away the debris until Lawrence's flashlight revealed a metal hatch flush with the floor, its surface green with oxidation but still solid. Heavy iron hinges suggested it had been built to last, and a combination lock secured whatever lay beneath. Lawrence tried every significant date he could remember. His father's birthday, his parents' anniversary, the year they'd bought the homestead. Nothing. Then, on impulse, he tried the numbers engraved on his father's pocket watch, the one that had been passed down through 3 generations. November 23rd, 47. The lock clicked open. Inside the hidden compartment lay a cedar chest, its surface carved with the initials GW 1947. His father, George Whitman Green, the year he'd returned from the war. Lawrence's hands trembled as he lifted the heavy lid, releasing the scent of cedar and thyme. Rolled blueprints filled the chest, their edges yellowed but their lines still crisp and precise. Lawrence unrolled the first one carefully, his flashlight revealing intricate mechanical drawings unlike anything he'd ever seen. These weren't simple farm tools or basic machinery. They were sophisticated designs for mechanical harvesters, irrigation systems powered by renewable energy, and processing equipment that seemed decades ahead of their time. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in oiled leather, was a handwritten note in his father's careful script. "To my son and his sons after him, I have seen what machines can destroy, and I have dreamed of what they might build. These designs came to me in the hospital in France, when I watched good men die for other men's greed. I could not finish what I started, but perhaps one day this family will remember what it was born to build. Not empires of money, but legacies of purpose. The earth remembers everything we take from it, and everything we give back. Choose wisely. Your father, George Green, November 1947". Lawrence's voice caught as he read the final lines aloud. Wendy appeared at his shoulder, oxygen tank trailing behind her, her weathered hand settling over his with surprising strength. The blueprints spread before them showed machines that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture, designs that incorporated solar power and wind energy decades before such concepts became mainstream. His father hadn't just been a farmer. He'd been a visionary, an inventor whose dreams had been buried by circumstance and time. "Then let's remember," Wendy said softly, her words carrying the weight of 5 decades of partnership, of shared dreams deferred but never abandoned. "Let's remember what we were born to build." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken windows and setting the loose roof tin to singing. But for the first time since receiving Peter's deed, Lawrence felt something other than despair settle in his chest. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the stubborn green determination that had carried his family through wars, depressions, and betrayals. Either way, it would have to be enough. Winter bit hard that first month, but Lawrence and Wendy Green had survived worse. They slept in the truck with the engine running intermittently for heat, Ranger pressed between them like a living furnace, while they studied the blueprints by flashlight until their eyes burned and their fingers cramped from cold. The designs were brilliant, decades ahead of their time, but they required materials that didn't exist in 1947 and machining precision that seemed impossible without modern equipment. Lawrence traced the intricate gear assemblies with calloused fingers, understanding slowly dawning. His father hadn't just drawn machines. He'd drawn dreams deferred, waiting for a generation that would have the tools to make them real. "Look at this," Wendy said, pointing to a schematic for a solar-powered irrigation system. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air. He was designing renewable energy before anyone knew what to call it. Lawrence nodded, studying the elegant simplicity of the water collection system. He saw the future and drew us a map to get there. They began to rebuild on the third day, when the storm finally broke and pale sunlight revealed the true scope of their challenge. The homestead wasn't just damaged, it was a skeleton held together by ivy and stubbornness. But within that skeleton, Lawrence could see potential. He started by scavenging steel from the abandoned mining equipment scattered across the mountainside. Rusted conveyor belts, hydraulic pistons, and gear assemblies that had once moved tons of or became the raw materials for resurrection. Each piece had to be hauled down treacherous slopes and cleaned with wire brushes until his hands bled through work gloves worn thin as paper. Wendy, despite her failing lungs, proved invaluable in ways that surprised them both. Her years at the textile mill had taught her to see patterns in chaos, to understand how fabric moved under tension, how threads could be woven into strength. She restitched old conveyor belts into protective sleeves for the mechanical arms, her Singer sewing machine, one of the few things they'd brought from the apartment, humming steadily through the evening hours. "Muscle memory," she said when Lawrence marveled at her speed. "Some things the body never forgets." Each clang of Lawrence's hammer rang across the mountain valley like a bell announcing their defiance. Each whir of Wendy's sewing machine added another note to the symphony of reconstruction. Slowly, impossibly, the first prototype began to take shape in what had once been the homestead's parlor. The machine was crude compared to the elegant precision of the blueprints, welded where it should have been machined, bolted where it should have been seamless, but it embodied the same revolutionary principle: sustainable agriculture powered by renewable energy. Solar panels salvaged from an abandoned ranger station fed power to motors that Lawrence had rebuilt from scrap. Water flowed through channels carved from PVC pipe discovered in the mining camp's ruins. For 6 weeks, they worked 16-hour days, fueled by canned soup and stubborn determination. Ranger appointed himself supervisor, barking encouragement when gears meshed properly and whimpering concern when frustration led to thrown wrenches and muttered curses. The prototype's first test came on a bitter February morning when a wind howled down from the peaks and snow threatened to bury their work entirely. Lawrence connected the final circuit with fingers so numb he could barely feel the wire strippers. Wendy stood beside him, oxygen tank hissing steadily, her hand resting on the machine's central housing like a blessing. "Ready?" Lawrence asked. "We've been ready for 50 years, she replied. He threw the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the machine coughed, a deep mechanical sound that seemed to echo from the bowels of the earth. It coughed again, sputtered, and suddenly roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Gears turned. Pistons pumped. Solar collectors tracked the weak winter sun with mechanical precision while water flowed through channels that sparkled with frost. The prototype wasn't just working, it was thriving, breathing life into the dead homestead with every revolution of its central flywheel. Ranger barked, his tail high and proud, as if he'd personally engineered the miracle. The decrepit house shuddered around them, ancient pipes rattling as though awakening from a decades-long sleep. Dust cascaded from the ceiling beams, and for a moment, Lawrence could swear he heard his father's laughter echoing through the walls. They stood together in the flickering light of battery-powered lanterns, watching their impossible machine transform the frozen wasteland outside into the first stages of an agricultural revolution. Steam rose from the solar collectors, creating ghostly patterns in the mountain air. Under the lamplight, Wendy smiled through tears that had nothing to do with the cold. Her face was streaked with grease and exhaustion, but her eyes blazed with the same fire that had sustained them through 5 decades of marriage, through Peter's betrayal, through their exile to this forgotten place. "He took our home," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "But not our hands." Lawrence wrapped his arms around his wife, feeling the solid warmth of her against the mountain cold, hearing the steady rhythm of their machine counting out the seconds of their new life. Somewhere far below, in his glass tower overlooking the city, Peter Green was probably signing another contract, cutting another tie, building another empire on the foundation of other people's dreams. But here, in the ruins of the past, Lawrence and Wendy Green were building something different. Something that would grow from the soil their son had abandoned. Something that would bloom from the seeds of forgiveness and flourish in the light of remembered purpose. The machine hummed on through the night, a heartbeat in the darkness, pumping life back into the land that had waited so long for someone to remember what it was meant to become. Spring arrived like a resurrection, melting the snow that had entombed their world for months and revealing the miracle they'd wrought in defiance of winter's cruelty. The prototype machine had evolved through countless nights of tinkering into something magnificent, a hybrid harvester that moved across the mountain terrain with mechanical grace, its solar collectors gleaming like scales on some benevolent dragon. Lawrence was plowing the south field on a crystalline April morning when he heard the grinding of an overheated engine on the access road below. A battered Ford pickup had pulled over, steam pouring from under its hood, its driver, a weathered man in coveralls, standing hands on hips beside the disabled vehicle. "Trouble," Lawrence called down, guiding his machine to the edge of the field. "Radiators gone," the stranger replied, squinting up at the impossible sight above him. "But I'll be damned if that ain't the prettiest piece of engineering I've seen in 30 years on the road." The mechanic introduced himself as Jake Morrison, a traveling repair specialist who serviced equipment across 3 states. He'd seen every kind of agricultural machinery manufactured in the last 4 decades, but nothing like Lawrence's creation. While Lawrence helped him patch the radiator with stop leak and mountain spring water, Jake couldn't stop staring at the harvester. "Mind if I ask who built that beauty?" Jake said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "My father designed it in 1947, Lawrence replied, pride evident in his voice. "I just finally figured out how to make it work." "Your father was a genius." "My father was a dreamer. I'm just a stubborn old fool with too much time and too little sense." Jake laughed, but his expression grew serious as he watched the machine resume its work, cutting through the soil with precision that put modern equipment to shame. "You mind if I film this? I got a mechanics blog, nothing fancy, just shop talk for gearheads. But this is something special." Lawrence shrugged. "Don't see why not." Jake pulled out his phone, a device that seemed impossibly sophisticated compared to the antique flip phone Lawrence still carried. For the next 10 minutes, he recorded the harvester's operation, capturing the fluid motion of its arms, the solar collectors tracking the sun, the elegant efficiency that transformed sustainable farming from theory into poetry. "What do you call it?" Jake asked as he finished filming. Lawrence thought for a moment. "Greenworks," he said finally. "After my father. After the work he started." That evening, Jake uploaded the video to his YouTube channel with the title, "The Old Man Who Outbuilt Silicon Valley." His description was simple. Somewhere in the Colorado Rockies, a 70-year-old mechanic is revolutionizing agriculture with machines designed by his father in 1947. This is what innovation looks like when it grows from the ground up. The video spread like wildfire through agricultural forums, engineering communities, and social media networks that Lawrence had never heard of. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By the end of the week, that number had climbed to 500,000. Comments poured in from around the world. "Real innovation has wrinkles. Meet the true green revolution. This man just made John Deere look like Fisher-Price. When genius meets necessity, miracles happen. I want to buy one. How do I contact them?" That last comment appeared dozens of times in various forms. Wendy, who had grudgingly learned to use Lawrence's laptop to research parts suppliers, found herself staring at an inbox flooded with inquiries from farmers, agricultural cooperatives, and sustainable energy advocates. Lawrence, she called from the kitchen table they'd converted into their office space. You need to see this. He found her surrounded by printed emails, her expression somewhere between bewildered and elated. Suppliers are calling, she said, holding up a stack of messages. Equipment manufacturers, solar panel companies, hydraulic specialists. They want to discuss partnerships. Partnerships. And orders, Lawrence. Lots of orders. By the following Monday, the phone, their old landline that Jake had helped them install, rang constantly. Farmers from Montana to Mexico wanted to know if Greenworks could build them machines. Agricultural colleges inquired about licensing the technology. A documentary filmmaker called from Los Angeles, asking if she could visit to film their story. Wendy, ever practical, registered Greenworks LLC with the state of Colorado that afternoon, using the laptop and a credit card that trembled in her arthritic fingers. For the company tagline, she scribbled in her careful handwriting, "Built by hands, powered by heart." We need to think about this carefully, she told Lawrence as they sat on their rebuilt porch that evening, watching Ranger chase rabbits through the sprouting vegetables. This could get bigger than we ever imagined. Lawrence nodded, studying the blueprints spread across his lap. New designs he'd been developing based on his father's original concepts. My father dreamed of machines that would help feed the world without poisoning it. Maybe that dream doesn't have to die with us. The video's view count had passed 1 million. Jake Morrison called to tell them that agricultural equipment manufacturers were asking for his contact information, that venture capital firms were inquiring about investment opportunities, that Peter Green's own company had reached out through intermediaries. Peter? Lawrence asked, his voice carefully neutral. Green Industries, Jake confirmed. They want to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. Lawrence was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their resurrection. Somewhere far below, in his glass tower, his son was probably discovering that the parents he'd discarded had become more valuable than the empire he'd built. Tell them, Lawrence said finally, that Greenworks doesn't collaborate. We build. And what we build to last. Wendy squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with the same fire that had sustained them through their darkest winter. Around them, the homestead hummed with purpose. Solar panels charging batteries, water flowing through irrigation channels, the prototype machine resting like a faithful animal in the barn they'd rebuilt from salvaged timber. They'd planted seeds in abandoned soil and watched miracles grow. Now the world was watching too, and the harvest was just beginning. Peter Green stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a circuit board of ambition and avarice. The morning news played on the wall-mounted screen behind him, a constant stream of market updates and corporate announcements that usually provided the soundtrack to his empire building. Today, however, the familiar rhythm was shattered by a story that made his blood freeze in his veins. A retired craftsman and his wife have created a breakthrough in sustainable machinery that's revolutionizing agriculture across the American West, the anchor announced with the kind of reverence usually reserved for tech billionaires and Nobel laureates. Lawrence and Wendy Green, working from a remote homestead in Colorado, have built what experts are calling the most innovative farming equipment in decades. Peter's Mont Blanc pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the glass desk where merger documents lay forgotten. On the screen, footage rolled of his father operating a machine that seemed to have materialized from some impossible dream. Solar panels tracking the sun with mechanical precision, harvester arms moving with fluid grace, the entire apparatus working in harmony with the mountain landscape rather than dominating it. The camera zoomed in on a weathered logo welded to the machine's side. Greenworks, stylized with the same family crest that Peter had systematically erased from his own company's materials 5 years ago. The crest his grandfather had designed, the one that represented 3 generations of green ingenuity, now gleamed defiantly from equipment that made his own sustainable technology look like expensive toys. The company, Greenworks LLC, has received orders from farming cooperatives across 6 states, the reporter continued. What's remarkable is that this revolutionary technology emerged from blueprints drawn in 1947 by the late George Green, a World War II veteran whose vision of sustainable agriculture was decades ahead of its time. Peter's assistant knocked softly on the door. Mr. Green. The Craftwork executives are waiting in conference room A. Tell them to wait, Peter said without turning around, his voice hollow. Tell them I'll be there shortly. The news segment continued, and Peter found himself transfixed by images of the parents he'd discarded standing beside their impossible creation. His mother, oxygen tank at her side but eyes blazing with purpose. His father, weathered hands resting proudly on machinery that represented everything Peter had convinced himself the Green family could never achieve. Industry analysts are calling it the true green revolution, the anchor said, and Peter's stomach clenched as the camera panned across testimonials from farmers whose lives had been transformed by his parents' work. What sets Greenworks apart isn't just their innovative technology, but their commitment to accessible pricing and genuine environmental stewardship. The segment concluded with a graphic that hit Peter like a physical blow. Greenworks surpasses Green Industries in Public Trust Index. Below it, polling data showed that consumers trusted the mountain craftsman more than the billion-dollar corporation that bore the same name. Peter grabbed the remote and stabbed the power button, plunging the office into silence. But the words echoed in the sudden quiet, reverberating through the glass and steel monument to his success like accusations he couldn't silence. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since he'd signed those papers erasing his family from his life, Peter Green felt small. He sank into his leather chair, the city sprawling below him like evidence of his conquests, and tried to understand how the parents he'd abandoned as dead weight had become the very thing he'd spent decades trying to build. Authentic innovators whose work mattered beyond profit margins and stock prices. His computer chimed with an urgent email from his head of marketing. Media requesting comment on Greenworks' story. How should we respond? Peter stared at the screen, his reflection ghost-like in the monitor's surface. How could he respond? How could he explain that the couple revolutionizing sustainable agriculture were the same people he'd exiled to a condemned property because they embarrassed his carefully crafted image? His phone buzzed with texts from board members, investors, and competitors all asking the same questions. Who were these Greenworks people? How had Green Industries missed this technology? Was there a connection between the companies beyond the name? There was a connection, of course. The deepest connection possible. But acknowledging it would mean admitting that his greatest business mistake hadn't been a failed acquisition or misread market trend. It had been cutting ties with the two people who understood innovation not as a buzzword, but as a sacred calling. Through the window, Peter could see the digital billboard that had displayed his face for 3 years, announcing him as the future of sustainable business. Today, it showed an advertisement for luxury watches, his image replaced by someone else's aspirations. He thought of his parents sleeping in a truck through a mountain winter, working 16-hour days to bring their father's dreams to life while he signed papers in climate-controlled boardrooms. He thought of Ranger, the family dog whose loyalty he'd dismissed as inconvenient, now probably patrolling the homestead that had become the headquarters of a revolution he'd never seen coming. The intercom buzzed again. Mr. Green. Craftwork is asking if we should reschedule. Peter looked at the merger documents on his desk, at the contracts that would make him richer and more powerful, at the empire he'd built by discarding everything that had made the Green name meaningful in the first place. No, he said quietly. Tell them the meeting is cancelled. For the first time in years, Peter Green had something more important to do than make money. He had to figure out how to apologize to the parents who had just reminded the world what true innovation looked like, and why the name Green had once meant something worth building a legacy around. Outside his window, the city hummed with ambition and commerce, but Peter could only hear the echo of machinery working in harmony with the land, powered by love and built by hands that had never forgotten how to create something beautiful from nothing at all. The media circus arrived on a Tuesday morning like a plague of mechanical locusts, their satellite trucks and camera crews swarming the mountain road that had known only silence for decades. News vans from Denver, Phoenix, and Salt Lake City created a traffic jam of ambition on the narrow gravel drive, while reporters in designer hiking boots stumbled across terrain that Ranger navigated with effortless grace. Lawrence and Wendy watched the invasion from their rebuilt porch, coffee cups steaming in the thin mountain air as journalists set up their equipment with the urgency of conquistadors claiming new territory. The homestead that had sheltered their resurrection now served as the backdrop for their triumph, every angle captured and broadcast to a world hungry for authentic success stories. This is what victory looks like, Wendy said, her oxygen tank hissing softly as camera crews framed shots of their prototype machine. Strangers telling our story better than we ever could. A correspondent from CNN was conducting a live broadcast in front of the barn when the black sedan appeared on the horizon, its sleek silhouette alien against the rough mountain landscape. The vehicle moved with deliberate precision down the winding access road, and Lawrence felt his stomach tighten with recognition even before he could make out the occupant. The cameras turned like predators sensing fresh blood. Peter Green's Tesla Model S, Lawrence recognized it from magazine profiles, pulled into the gravel drive with the soft whisper of electric motors and technological superiority. For a moment, the car sat idling while its occupant gathered whatever courage had brought him to this moment of public reckoning. Then the door opened, and Peter emerged into the mountain sunlight like an actor stepping onto a stage he'd never wanted to perform on. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his parents' monthly Social Security check. His hair perfectly styled despite the 4-hour drive from the city. But beneath the carefully constructed image, Lawrence could see the boy who used to help him fix tractors on summer mornings, the child who'd asked 1,000 questions about how things worked and why they mattered. The reporters surged forward like a tide of ambition and microphones, but Peter ignored them completely. His focus remained laser-sharp on the two figures standing on the porch of the house he'd condemned them to, the parents he'd tried to erase now commanding more respect than his billion-dollar empire had ever earned. Lawrence descended the porch steps slowly, his work boots crunching on gravel as he moved to meet his son in the center of the media storm. Wendy followed, her oxygen tank trailing behind her like a mechanical conscience, the sound of her labored breathing audible in the sudden hush that fell over the assembled crowd. "What brings you home, son?" Lawrence asked, his voice carrying across the mountain air with surprising strength. His hands, stained with grease and honest work, crossed over his chest like armor against the reconciliation he wasn't ready to offer. Peter hesitated, and in that pause, Lawrence could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The risk assessment, the cost-benefit analysis of public humiliation versus potential profit. Even here, even now, his son couldn't stop being a businessman long enough to be human. "I came to invest," Peter said finally, his voice pitched for the cameras as much as his parents'. "Greenworks has created something remarkable. I'd like to discuss partnership opportunities." Wendy shook her head, the movement sharp enough to cut through decades of accumulated disappointment. "You came to reclaim," she said, her words carrying the weight of truth that no amount of corporate spin could disguise. "You discarded us when we were worthless, and now you want us back because we're valuable." The cameras captured every nuance of the confrontation. The son's expensive suit contrasting with his parents' work clothes, the sleek sedan parked beside their battered pickup truck, the empire builder facing the empire he'd unknowingly destroyed by abandoning its foundations. Before the world's watching eyes, Peter extended a manicured hand toward his father, a gesture that might have been reconciliation or acquisition, depending on your perspective. Lawrence stared at the offered hand for a long moment, and the silence stretched until it became a statement louder than any words could have been. Then, with deliberate precision, he kept his arms crossed and let his son's hand hang empty in the mountain air. "You taught me ambition," Peter said quietly, his voice barely audible over the whir of camera motors and the whisper of mountain wind through pine trees. "You never taught me humility." The words hung between them like an accusation that cut both ways, condemning the student for failing to learn and the teacher for failing to teach. But Lawrence's response carried the weight of 5 decades of fatherhood and 50 years of watching dreams deferred. "No," he replied, his voice steady despite the cameras recording every syllable for posterity. "You stopped listening before the lesson." Around them, the media storm continued its mechanical dance of documentation and dissemination. But the real story was playing out in the space between two men who shared name but had forgotten how to share anything else. One had built an empire on other people's dreams. The other had built a legacy from the dreams others had discarded. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility, of machinery humming in harmony with the land, of seeds planted in abandoned soil finally bearing fruit. But it also carried the weight of words that couldn't be unsaid, choices that couldn't be unmade, and love that had been tested beyond its breaking point. Somewhere in the crowd of reporters and cameramen, Ranger barked once, a sound that might have been warning or welcome, depending on how you chose to hear it. The dog, at least, still remembered that family was supposed to mean something more than opportunity. The footage of Peter's rejected handshake played on news cycles for weeks, becoming a viral symbol of accountability in an age of corporate impunity. But as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the Green family saga took a darker turn that no one, least of all Peter himself, could have anticipated. The first domino fell on a Tuesday in October when the Securities and Exchange Commission announced a federal investigation into Green Industries' accounting practices. What began as routine scrutiny of the Kraftwerk merger quickly metastasized into something far more damaging: a comprehensive audit that revealed years of financial manipulation, environmental violations disguised as sustainability initiatives, and a complex web of offshore accounts that made Peter's empire look less like innovation and more like elaborate fraud. Within 72 hours, investors began fleeing like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Stock prices plummeted from $347 per share to $23 in a single trading day, wiping out billions in market capitalization and leaving pension funds, retirement accounts, and institutional investors holding worthless paper where gold had once gleamed. The irony wasn't lost on financial journalists, who noted that Green Industries, a company built on the promise of sustainable business practices, had been systematically poisoning both the environment and the public trust while its founder stood on stages preaching about corporate responsibility and environmental stewardship. Peter's empire collapsed with the swift brutality that only modern capitalism could provide. Federal marshals seized assets, froze accounts, and padlocked corporate headquarters while former allies distanced themselves with the calculated precision of political survivors. The merger with Kraftwerk evaporated overnight, German executives issuing statements about fundamental misrepresentations and irreconcilable differences in corporate ethics. By November, Peter Green, once celebrated as the youngest sustainable technology mogul in American history, was facing federal charges for securities fraud, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to defraud investors. His mansion on the Hill went into foreclosure. His yacht was impounded by federal authorities, and his carefully curated image as an environmental visionary crumbled like autumn leaves in a mountain storm. Meanwhile, for hours away in the Colorado Rockies, Lawrence and Wendy Green were building something that would outlast any stock market fluctuation or federal investigation. Greenworks had evolved far beyond its humble origins in a condemned homestead. Orders poured in from farming cooperatives across 3 continents, but Lawrence and Wendy had made a conscious decision to expand slowly, carefully, sustainably. They hired local workers, many of them displaced by mining closures, and trained them in manufacturing techniques that honored both efficiency and craftsmanship. The company's second facility opened in a former textile mill in Lawrence's hometown, the same building where Wendy had destroyed her lungs working to fund their son's education. Now it hummed with purposeful activity as workers assembled machines that would help communities in Kenya harvest crops more efficiently, provide clean energy solutions for villages in Guatemala, and offer affordable agricultural technology to family farms across rural America. "We're not building a corporation," Wendy explained to a documentary filmmaker who'd traveled from New York to capture their story. "We're building a legacy. There's a difference." The numbers bore out their philosophy. While Green Industries hemorrhaged money and reputation, Greenworks reported modest but steady growth, reinvesting profits into research and development, worker training programs, and community initiatives. Their equipment costs 40% less than comparable technology from established manufacturers, not because they cut corners on quality, but because they refuse to prioritize shareholder profits over social impact. Agricultural colleges began incorporating Greenworks designs into their curricula. The Smithsonian requested Lawrence's original prototype for a permanent exhibition on American innovation. The United Nations invited the couple to speak at a conference on sustainable development, though they politely declined, preferring to let their work speak for itself. Most remarkably, the company maintained its commitment to accessible pricing even as demand skyrocketed. "My father didn't design these machines for rich people," Lawrence told a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. "He designed them for farmers. All farmers." As winter approached and Peter's legal troubles deepened, a journalist from Forbes published an analysis that captured the Green family saga with devastating clarity. The empire he discarded became the empire that replaced him. The article detailed how Greenworks had achieved something Green Industries never managed despite years of marketing spin: genuine innovation that served both profit and purpose. While Peter's company had promised sustainability while practicing deception, his parents had built actual sustainability from the ground up, creating jobs, solving problems, and proving that business could be both profitable and principled. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly on the homestead that had become headquarters for a quiet revolution, Lawrence and Wendy sat on their rebuilt porch watching Ranger patrol the grounds with the dignity of a CEO who'd earned his position through loyalty rather than manipulation. The machinery hummed in the workshops below, a mechanical symphony of purpose and productivity. Orders for the next quarter were already backlogged by 6 months, but Lawrence refused to rush production or compromise quality. Good work takes time, he'd tell impatient customers. If you want it fast, call someone else. If you want it right, we'll be here when you're ready. In the distance, the lights of Denver glowed against the horizon like a reminder of the world they'd left behind. Somewhere in that sprawl of ambition and commerce, their son was probably meeting with lawyers, calculating assets and liabilities, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of the empire he'd built on shifting foundations. But here in the mountains, Lawrence and Wendy Green had built something different. A company that measured success not just in quarterly earnings, but in communities empowered, problems solved, and promises kept. It wasn't the largest empire in their industry, but it might just be the most enduring. And as the snow continued to fall, covering the homestead in pristine white that gleamed like hope in the moonlight, they knew their father would be proud of what they'd finally learned to build. Spring came early that year, melting the snow with unseasonable warmth and filling the mountain air with the scent of pine sap and possibility. Lawrence was adjusting the calibration on their newest prototype when he heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel, though this time the engine's hum was different. Quieter, more humble than the electric whisper of executive privilege. Through the barn's open doors, he watched a modest Honda Civic navigate the winding drive with careful precision. No media convoy followed. No satellite trucks cluttered the access road. Just a single car carrying a single passenger toward whatever reckoning awaited at the end of the mountain path. Wendy looked up from the blueprints spread across their makeshift work table, her reading glasses reflecting the morning light streaming through dusty windows. "He's alone this time," she observed, her voice carrying neither satisfaction nor sorrow, just the flat acknowledgement of fact. Peter emerged from the car like a man stepping into a foreign country whose customs he didn't understand. Gone was the tailored armor of corporate success, replaced by jeans that looked like they'd been purchased yesterday and work boots that had never touched actual work. His hair was longer, unkempt, and the confident posture that had carried him through 1,000 boardroom conquests had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility. He approached the barn slowly, his movements tentative in a way that reminded Lawrence of the boy who used to ask permission before touching the tools in his grandfather's workshop. The federal ankle monitor around his left leg caught the morning light, a reminder of how far he'd fallen from the heights of his manufactured glory. "Dad," Peter said simply, stopping just inside the barn's threshold as if waiting for permission to enter his own family space. "Mom." Lawrence didn't look up from the engine housing he was examining, though his hands stilled on the wrench he'd been using. Beside him, Wendy continued studying the blueprints with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to find truth in technical drawings rather than human promises. "No reporters today?" Lawrence asked, his voice carefully neutral. "No reporters," Peter confirmed. "No lawyers, no advisors, no damage control specialists. Just me." The silence stretched between them like a chasm that years of mutual disappointment had carved in the mountain stone. In that quiet, Lawrence could hear the mechanical symphony of their operation. Solar panels tracking the sun, water pumps maintaining optimal pressure, the gentle hum of machinery that worked in harmony with the land rather than conquering it. "I don't want my old world back," Peter said finally, his words carrying the weight of a man who'd discovered that everything he'd built had been constructed on quicksand. "I can't get it back anyway. The house is gone, the company's gone, most of my so-called friends won't return my calls." He paused, seeming to gather courage for the next words. "I want to earn a place in yours." Lawrence set down his wrench with deliberate care, the metal ringing against the workbench like a bell marking some significant moment. He turned to study his son with eyes that had learned to see through corporate spin and manufactured sincerity, searching for whatever authentic intention might exist beneath years of accumulated deception. What he found there surprised him. Not the calculating ambition that had driven Peter's rise to power, not the desperate hunger of a man trying to claw his way back to relevance, but something that looked almost like genuine remorse. The kind of bone-deep understanding that only comes from losing everything you thought mattered and discovering it had never mattered at all. You know what it means to start where I did? Lawrence asked, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in textile mills, of hands that had built calluses before they'd built dreams. I think so, Peter replied, though his uncertainty was evident in the way his manicured fingers, still soft despite his fall from grace, fidgeted with the unfamiliar fabric of his new jeans. Lawrence studied him for a long moment, then reached for a second wrench from the pegboard where tools hung in the precise order that efficiency demanded. He held it out to his son like an offering, or maybe a test. Then start here, he said simply. Peter took the wrench with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from nerves or the delirium tremens of withdrawal from corporate adrenaline, Lawrence couldn't tell. But when his son knelt beside him on the oil-stained concrete floor, positioning himself to assist with the engine adjustment, Lawrence felt something shift in the careful architecture of his resentment. The work was simple but precise, adjusting fuel mixture ratios to optimize efficiency without sacrificing power. Peter's expensive jeans immediately acquired dark stains from the concrete, and his pristine work boots picked up streaks of grease that would never fully wash out. But he followed Lawrence's instructions with the focused attention of a man who understood that this might be his last chance to learn something that mattered. Counterclockwise, just a quarter turn, Lawrence instructed, watching as Peter's inexperienced hands fumbled with the adjustment. Feel for the resistance. The engine will tell you when it's right. As they worked, Ranger approached with the careful dignity of a judge evaluating a defendant's character. The golden retriever studied Peter for a long moment, then settled beside him on the concrete floor with a soft sigh that might have been acceptance, or at least the willingness to withhold judgment. He remembers you, Wendy observed from the work table, her voice carrying the first hint of warmth she'd shown her son in years. Peter's hand found the dog's head, scratching behind the ears with the unconscious affection of muscle memory. I remember him too, he said quietly. I remember all of it. I just forgot what it meant. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains that had witnessed their family's dissolution and resurrection, casting long shadows across the homestead that had become headquarters for a revolution built on forgiveness, persistence, and the radical idea that work could be both profitable and purposeful. In the barn where his grandfather's dreams had finally found expression, Peter Green began the long journey of learning what his father had always known, that the most valuable empires are built not with signatures and stock options, but with skilled hands, honest sweat, and the patience to create something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. 5 years had transformed the homestead into something that defied every prediction about corporate success and family reconciliation. Where once a condemned Victorian house had sagged under the weight of neglect, now a gleaming complex of workshops and laboratories stretched across the mountain plateau like a testament to the revolutionary power of second chances. Solar panels cascaded down the southern slope in precise geometric patterns, their surfaces tracking the sun with mechanical devotion while feeding clean energy into a grid that powered not just the Greenworks operation, but 3 neighboring communities that had struggled with unreliable electricity for decades. The original house still stood at the complex's heart, but it had been restored to a dignity that exceeded even its original grandeur. Wraparound porches rebuilt with sustainable timber, windows replaced with triple-pane glass that sparkled like promises kept, the foundation reinforced with the same stubborn determination that had saved the Green family from extinction. Children arrived every summer now, 30 or 40 bright-eyed teenagers from engineering programs across the country, drawn by Greenworks' reputation as the place where innovation met purpose and theory transformed into tools that changed lives. They lived in dormitories built from reclaimed materials, ate meals prepared in a kitchen that had once served Lawrence's grandfather, and learned from instructors who measured success not in patents filed or profits generated, but in problems solved and communities empowered. Peter had become one of those instructors, though his transformation from corporate titan to patient teacher had taken years of careful reconstruction. His hands, once soft with executive privilege, now bore the honest calluses of someone who understood machinery at the level of springs and gears. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face carried lines that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than inherited arrogance. Wealth isn't what you keep, he told a group of 17-year-olds gathered around the prototype that had started it all, the machine his grandfather had dreamed and his parents had built from scraps and determination. It's what you build for others. The students hung on his words with the intensity of young people discovering that success could mean something beyond stock options and corner offices. Some of them came from families that had lost farms to corporate agriculture. Others were the children of immigrants who understood that opportunity was something you created rather than something you inherited. All of them found in the Green story proof that failure could be the foundation for something greater than success. Lawrence, now 78 and moving with the careful dignity of someone whose body had earned its limitations, watched from the workshop's doorway as his son demonstrated the elegant simplicity of sustainable engineering. The bitterness that had once defined their relationship had been replaced by something more complex. Not the uncomplicated love of Peter's childhood, but the deeper respect that comes from witnessing genuine redemption. "He's a good teacher," Wendy observed, appearing at Lawrence's elbow with the oxygen tank that had become her constant companion. Her lungs had continued their decline, but her spirit blazed with undiminished fire, and her laughter still filled the house in the evenings when the work was done and the family gathered for dinner. "He learned from the best," Lawrence replied, though they both knew the real teaching had happened not in classrooms but in moments of shared labor, oil-stained hands working side by side to solve problems that mattered. At sunset, when the day's lessons ended and the students gathered for their evening meal, tourists often paused by the brass plaque that marked the entrance to what had become an unlikely pilgrimage destination. The inscription, simple and direct, told a story that resonated across cultures and languages. From abandonment to empire. The Green Legacy. Below it, in smaller letters, was the company motto that Wendy had scribbled on a notepad 5 years earlier. Built by hands, powered by heart. On this particular evening, as golden light painted the mountains in shades of honey and promise, 3 golden retriever puppies, Ranger's grandchildren, tumbled across the grass in pursuit of a tennis ball that one of the students had thrown. Ranger himself had passed 2 winters ago, but his legacy lived on in the next generation's boundless enthusiasm and unwavering loyalty to the family that had never forgotten what mattered most. Wendy's laughter drifted through the open windows of the main house, where she was helping students with their evening calculations. The sound carried across the complex like music, touching every corner of the empire they'd built from abandonment and exile. Lawrence stood on the porch where he'd first read the deed that had seemed like punishment but had become salvation, watching the sun settle behind peaks that had witnessed every moment of their resurrection. The workshops hummed with purposeful activity as the night shift took over production, manufacturing equipment that would help communities in Bangladesh harvest rice more efficiently, provide clean water to villages in Honduras, and offer affordable agricultural solutions to family farms across the American heartland. Peter joined him on the porch, his day's teaching finished, his own sense of purpose finally aligned with something larger than personal ambition. Together, father and son watched the lights of their complex twinkle in the gathering darkness, each illuminated window representing work that mattered, dreams that had found expression, and the radical notion that business could serve both profit and humanity. "Funny thing about empire," Lawrence said finally, his voice low but carrying the certainty of someone who discovered truth in the most unlikely places. "The strongest ones are built on forgiveness." Peter nodded, understanding in ways that success had never taught him. Around them, the night settled over the mountains with the gentle authority of something permanent and good, and the Green Legacy hummed on, not in boardrooms or stock exchanges, but in the workshops where tomorrow's innovations were taking shape under the patient guidance of hands that had learned to build not just for profit, but for the promise of a better world.